All right. Well, it's been a couple weeks, but we are back with another episode of Future of Church, where we are exploring the landscape of faith, well, the intersection of faith, technology, culture, all sorts of stuff. And I am Christopher.
And I'm Joe.
All right, there you go. Hey, we nailed it. We even practiced that one backstage. No, so I'm looking forward to this. We're just going to have a conversation today, just talking practically about what does it look like as believers to engage with AI when it comes to things like prepping for a sermon or doing a Bible study or trying to do a deeper dive into scripture or even writing an academic paper type of a thing. How do we walk this line in terms of what does that look like and how do we do it well? And so, yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Joe, you any thoughts on this one? I'm curious. You mentioned an article that came up, or a conversation you had that had you thinking about it a little bit.
Yeah, it was actually a tweet with an infographic.
Okay. You mean an X?
Yeah, I know. I can't stop. I've
I
tried.
can't. I know. I don't think it's ever
tried.
going to stick, to be honest.
It's impossible, I think. It's probably not impossible. I'm not willing to put in the effort. But yeah, I was talking about in the academic world a call for setting aside AI detectors in favor of real conversations in place of like having a series of if your issue is with like papers and written assignments, that you have a more frequent cadence of those so you can measure growth throughout the year. Like, is this person's writing changing and improving throughout the year? Or are they going back to the same well and just producing the same quality of papers over and over again?
And what AI models have been released in that time frame that may be improving it?
Right. And more education about how to use AI appropriately, as opposed to just saying don't touch it. Rather saying, okay, this is how you can use it, and this is kind of the expectation. And I think we talked about this on an earlier episode, maybe one of our first ones.
We touched on it briefly.
Yeah, just that idea that I had, that I'm like, we still have pencils and paper. I mean, you can do in-class written assignments. You have, really locked down, Chromebooks that a lot of schools use that say you can't even get to these things. Like, there's other ways you can do stuff to gauge a person's, writing acumen if you're really, really concerned about them using AI in specific scenarios. But I just liked the part I liked is the one I started with, just like encouraging more conversation and engagement, both you with the students just generally, and also with, how do you use this in a way that's acceptable, where you're not just, using something else to do your work for you, do all of your thinking for you. Because I think of course, the big fear, and anytime there's progress, there's like this associated fear with, what are we going to lose because we've introduced this? Okay, we no longer have this skill because we're not exercising that muscle anymore because we have this other thing to do it for us. And I think we're having another round of fear around, are we losing our critical thinking skills? Are we losing our ability to be coherent as individuals?
Which I think is a legitimate risk. I mean, that's the thing. Yeah. I'm around this enough and see people engage with it enough where I go, it is a legitimate risk that people will become over dependent on the technology.
Well, and it's interesting, even some of the others. I have a cousin who's a first grade teacher, and someone asked her about the biggest impact she's seeing. She's been a teacher for a long time, of the transition, like tablets and things like that over computers. And her first thing is loss of fine motor, like, because kids are just tapping and doing macro movements to do stuff. Their fine motor skills aren't as developed as when they were drawing with crayons and markers and all that. And so, there's probably going to be some impacts even outside of, what we're thinking intellectually, as well. I was talking to a friend as you know him as well, but I won't drop his name in our conversation, but talking about Samsung with their fitness ring, and
Oh,
their whole
yeah.
ecosystem. Like it could say, okay, you're burning this many calories. Here's here's the food you need to intake. We're going to meal plan for you. By the way, if you have a Samsung fridge, it's going to check to see what ingredients you have and make a grocery
It's
list
going to
for
order
you
your
if you need it.
groceries so you don't have to do it.
Yeah, and hey, by the way, if you have a Samsung oven and it's also connected and you got to bake something, we'll even turn that on and get it preheated for you on your way home from work, so you just throw it in the oven, and it's
I mean, so what's your thoughts? I'm actually genuinely curious because we
yeah,
started with just the writing piece,
yeah,
but I'm curious what are your thoughts? Like, because honestly, I have mixed feelings sometimes about the weight we put on the importance of certain things where I'm like, I
right,
don't know. Like sometimes there's things that I feel like we don't care enough about. And
right,
then there's other things where I'm like, we value certain things that it's like, why are we valuing this like when I think going back to writing, the
yeah,
actual activity of putting words on a page to me is a very mechanical. I think there's some value to understanding sentence structure and to be able to think through how you do that type of thing.
mhm,
But the actual tippy typing of stuff into it or handwriting it out, sometimes I'm like, if something else can do the rote work, but you're still actively putting your critical thinking skills into editing, shaping, molding that, is it and depending on the day, I go back and forth. So I even think of the example of your fitness ring where it's like, well, you got a whole Samsung kitchen that plans your groceries, preheats your oven at the right time, literally tells you what to bring out.
yeah,
I can see where in some sense you could go, having it do all that makes you dumber and just lazier.
no,
But then on another side of me goes, yeah, but is the time that goes into figuring all this out that sometimes just leads you to go, you know what, I'm just going to eat Doritos and chocolate chip cookies for dinner because it's easier.
yeah,
Like, honestly, I have mixed
yeah,
feelings sometimes on like, oh, when do we cross that line where our complacency
yeah.
or tech dependency goes too far?
Yeah. Well, and I think a lot of it, and I think this goes back to kind of individual conversations that um, need to happen for individual discernment is just who are you and what do you value? So, like for me, like one of my things I think you know this about me is I'll put reminders on my phone. Like I put like AI didn't do it, the
Yeah.
bot did. I put it on the phone, and then the phone rings and says you have to do this thing, and I go, you don't get to tell me what to do, you stupid phone. You know?
Dismiss.
Yeah, and then it doesn't happen because I'm mad at the phone for the thing I told it to do for me, for
Yeah.
my own benefit. Like I can be that way sometimes. And so there's a little bit of that, but also like I really enjoy the idea of periodically, not all the time. So, this is even situational for me, like thinking through what do I want to cook? Like, what have I not made recently that I just really want to make? Okay, what is that going to take? Do I have the time? Do I have the ingredients? Am I gonna? And then I go do it, and I enjoy that
Yeah.
process. And some people really enjoy doing that on a macro level. But
Yeah.
you think like, what if you're like a private chef for someone and you want to be able to take on more accounts, and you're already probably working for people with means? What if you're the one prepping the food and you're the prepper, but you don't have to think about every detail that goes on in the background, because if they all have connected devices and there's a way for you to get into that ecosystem, you don't
Yeah.
have to put as much thought into that part of the work. Or you're a restaurant owner, or you're just trying to start up a new restaurant and you're trying to manage inventory smartly, and it's you and a small team. And I've never looked it up, but from people I've known in the restaurant industry, I know it's not a high overhead thing to start with, usually, let alone when you first get started. And and so I think it's very situational. The other one you're talking about, writing like pen to paper, I am still one, and it's probably as much nurture as it is nature, but I remember things better if I took a pen, even if it's
right. And I've known that about you for years. And for me, I hate writing things down because it's a giant waste of time for me. I literally like, I used to be like, no, I should take notes because everybody always says you're supposed to take notes. And for me, it was like, this is a cosmic waste of my time. It's actually distracting me from focusing on the thing. And I'm actually not listening because I'm too concerned with making sure I'm writing the right. But again, those are dynamic differences between the two of us. Where it's like, I couldn't go, Joe, you really shouldn't, do this. Like an example for me that came up recently was I was talking with somebody about it. And I was saying how I had to go mow the lawn. And they asked if I had ever looked into autonomous mowers. And I was like, actually, I have. There's one that, I can get. It'll mow 6 acres and it does a slope as steep as ours. And I've gone back and forth on whether I should do it because I actually enjoy mowing the lawn because it's my opportunity to not have 8 people around me, whatever. Nobody disturbs me when I'm mowing the lawn. It's actually a time when I actually am in prayer most of the time or listening to scripture. And so I'm like, I could, and maybe it would be nice to have the option to do it, but I could also see that lead me to not want to do it because I'm like, you know what, I'll just have the Yarbo go do it for me type. And so even I sometimes am like, and maybe that's almost more the topic we're talking about is like, where does tech dependence, where is that line? And how do we be really mindful of it? Because I think that's one of the greatest risks of AI is it gives you what you want.
Well,
and it can give you what you want at a level like we've never experienced before.
And it also just you talking about your experience pre-AI and all these tools saying, hey, I guess everyone else is taking notes. I want to appear engaged, so I'm going to take notes as well, and that interrupting your experience. But also because of the influence of your surroundings, the flip side can then happen where if you're sitting there and you're like, well, I mean, no one else is taking notes because we all know there's a transcript where someone's going to dump it into AI and get it out. Maybe writing makes you look less engaged now. And so to look engaged, you just don't. And now you're the one going, gosh, I hope I remember all this stuff because I don't want to be looking like an idiot. So it's like it creates its own cultural norms and around all of this stuff, just depending on how you adopt it and which environment you're in. Because you can be in an environment that's really slow to pick this stuff up, and so the culture there doesn't move at the same pace as another environment you might find yourself in, which I think brings us right back around to the church in many ways. Because I can tell you, even though I think AbbVie is, in some areas, they're very fast. In other areas, not as much. In terms of AI, and there's plenty of that going on in other pharmaceuticals and whatever. But then at our church, like the words or letters, is it words or letters at this point? Letters AI, barely spoken. It's on nobody's radar unless they're keeping it to themselves or it's happening in smaller conversations.
Well, and I'm just thinking about this in terms of like, again, and for people who are involved in a church and thinking through some of this stuff, I'm sure that there are probably a lot of mixed feelings related to the idea of, okay, what if the sermon now is recorded, transcribed, and a summary of it is sent out to everybody? Could that be a really helpful thing? It could, in a sense of, for people who were engaged, but maybe they don't always remember everything or they're not note takers type of a thing. But that also could lead people to go, well, I'm not going to really pay attention. Or I'm not even going to go because I'll just wait till the recording comes out and get this Cliff Notes version. And I get... the problem is I can see people fighting against it and going, and this is why we're not going to do AI because it's bad, instead of going, yeah, but there also could be some inherent really valuable things that could come from it.
And I could see a church recognizing that, okay, there's a group of people for whom this would be super helpful. So we'll do it every week and we'll put it in a location, but we'll tell nobody about it.
Right.
And then as we find out about these people, we'll give them links to go find that thing.
Like in
also,
your church, because you're in the leadership team.
Yeah.
So is there any application of AI being used within the church for any of this stuff?
Not that I'm aware of. Like in our congregation, no. Amongst our leaders, we have one pastor who's very interested in AI as a topic, just because he works with students, and he's like, "Well, this is a part of our students' lives. We need to understand this." So
that's why it's concerning, not concerning, but I think this is where I talk to a lot of Christian leaders, and I'm like, you need to be talking about this, because the reality is this is part of everybody's life now. And being a Christian is just living, and people need help thinking through some of this stuff, because they just, if you don't, you're just going to go with whatever the culture tells you or whatever works best for you. And that's not usually a very healthy path.
Well, and I think that's where like engagement around how to use AI responsibly for ministry work is like, it's going to be increasingly important, especially as, if you're in a church that's shrinking, for example, and use cases in the other direction too. But this is where my head's at this exact moment, where you have fewer hands, or you're in a church that's very much towards, church as a commodity as opposed to a service gathering where people are interacting and all of that. But, to say, hey, we want to do outreach to our community. Our pastors are really interested in doing this, but our pastors are spending 75% of their time creating sermons, creating coursework, creating whatever. What if you could cut your prep time in half, by having AI assist with things in a way that's smart, but you're still evaluating literally everything that comes out. You're crafting the message in your own language. You're doing all this stuff, but now you can spend that other 25% chunk of your time now on outreach, like direct ministry to people.
Well, I think one of the questions you hit on there is, and this is one of the things that in a lot of the advisory work I do around AI, is making sure people have answered the question, what are you going to do with that time you get back?
Yeah.
And if you haven't thought through that, that's a problem, because going back to it, if you're a church leader and you go, hey, this is great, I can use AI to cut my sermon prep down 50%. And you haven't thought through, right? So then what are you going to do with that extra 50%? And that extra 50% goes back to, whatever else fills in the gaps instead of being really intentional. It could actually be a really negative thing, because it might give you time that isn't being used for really positive, God-honoring purposes.
Yeah. Well, and also, thinking about it in terms of, because I know we've done a few of these comparisons, like what's the actual difference between the way life is now and the way life would be if we were using AI heavily, is, we already know that there are pastors who, whether it's on a regular basis or periodic basis for good intentions or ill, whatever, like they've been teaching for a long time. They have that filed drawer, or, digital or otherwise, just filled with sermons. They can just go, let's go back through Ephesians, pull that one out. And, and if you're doing that, and if that's what you're doing, you're recycling it, and you're spending like 10 minutes brushing it up and a few minutes rehearsing it, and you're fine. You're okay with that because you did the work previously. Okay, fine. But then, the question is still there. What do you do with the rest of the time now?
Well, and I think one of these other things that, again, as we think through, and I think these are a lot of the questions that we just have to, again, be wrestling through, talking about, and being discerning, from a biblical standpoint. But I also just think of, this is where we have to avoid this idea that the way we used to do it was somehow better because it was harder. And I see that happen in the work environment all the time, where you'll see senior leaders who are opposed to working from home because they're like, I never had the opportunity to do that. I've had to drive into an office and da 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 da. And so it's lazy. And I can see there being some resistance to, well, there's value in spending 8 hours a week preparing your sermon, when it's like, well, but if you could do it in 4, so you can use that time in a more meaningful way, is it somehow, are we resistant to this just because that's how we used to do it? And I think there's a lot of stuff that we have to consider with this, but I'm curious, how would you feel if, and I guess some of the questions you brought up, but like, how would you feel? And I think this is one of the things that I'm always curious about, like people's reaction. How would you feel if it came out that your pastor had their sermons generated by AI, and really they just kind of looked over it and then kind of put their spin on it and present it? Like, would you have an issue with it? Would you what would be like your initial reaction? Honest.
I think my initial reaction would be, okay, but to what extent?
Okay.
Like,
it's a fair question,
because that would be and then the why. I think some would depend on the pastor too. So like our current lead pastor is one where I would be absolutely shocked to hear that he was doing it. And so my first question would be like, what happened? But that's because of the person. But to say, like, okay, are you just brushing it up? Are you just browsing through and making some edits and going, good enough? Or are you like double checking things? Are you, making sure that we're not skipping over passages? Are we making sure passages are transcribed correctly? And we're doing, like an actual like QC of it. I think those would be some of the questions, is what do you mean by brush it up, and put it in your own voice? I think would be a little bit of where my questions would be. Okay. I think if it was a pastor I didn't know well, my honest first reaction, like if I walked into a church and someone's like, just, this pastor does,
AI sermons,
just does AI sermons. This is the process. I'd be like, okay, who is this dude? I don't know him. I don't know his theology. I don't know if I can trust him. I don't know how much of this is AI talking versus how much is him talking. I would have a lot of those questions that would breed a lot of anxiety, at least initially. That said, that's me. That puts that puts the weight of discernment on me to say, okay, I'm going to listen. I'm going to listen critically. I'm going to check, what's going on with scripture myself and say, okay, this is good teaching or it's not good teaching. And hopefully then have conversations, one way or the other. But I mean, again, should I not be doing that now? Like if I walked in a church and this person says everything this man writes is completely homegrown, he makes his own pencils, he whittles them down by hand, and then he writes everything out long form.
He writes it on papyrus he created in his woodshed.
He has his own wood pulper and he makes his own paper and everything. The whole process is in his control. He loves and cares for it so much,
Well, I think that's one of the dangers is sometimes we can go, if somebody did that,
right,
I don't need to put the critical thought into it because obviously they cared so much for it. I don't need to be discerning because they've done. And I think that can actually be dangerous in some senses.
And that's where it comes back around to, I think it was our last conversation, 2 conversations ago, where it's like all of the things that we're worried about so far that we've talked about. I'm sure there's going to be something that the exception, as my wife likes to say, the exception that proves the point, is like all the things you're thinking, oh, we're going to have to do all these things so that we're ready for AI. Like, are all things you should be doing now already, with things that are not
which
AI driven.
here's the thing, and I think that's one of the biggest misunderstandings, but I think it's also why we need to prepare people for this, is AI doesn't do anything new. It just accelerates or exacerbates what's already in place.
No.
But it does it at a level like we've never experienced in all of human history.
Yeah.
And I think that's the concerning part, is if you're complacent, AI is going to make you 1,000 times more complacent.
Right.
If you're a workaholic, AI is going to make you 1,000 times more of a workaholic. If you're easily distracted and you don't really pay attention to people, AI is just going to make it easier for you to not pay attention and listen to people, because you're going to go, I don't need to, because AI is going to give me the Cliff Notes version. I don't need to engage, type of a thing. And I think that's actually one of the concerns is, to your point, we almost have to go back to, hey, what really is at the heart of this? And where is our heart today? Because if it's in the wrong place, regardless of what it is, this is just going to crank the volume to 11 on any of it. If you're the pastor that's just going, from your dust cabinet, AI is probably you're going to be tempted to go, well, heck, I don't even have to do that anymore. I can just have it do the whole thing and not have to.
No.
And is that AI's fault?
No.
Not really. It's just exacerbating something that you probably should have addressed in yourself and gone, you know what, maybe I should be putting a little more critical thought into this.
Right. And if you're a person who loves rabbit holes, like, hey, that's interesting that AI came up with this thing. Let's learn more about that. Where did that come from? Rabbit hole.
Right.
And then you never get anything done.
Yeah. No, but I mean, I think this is something that, going back to it, it's going to be interesting to see in the coming, because I think, one of the challenges is, and you talked about it with this kitchen thing, I think for most people right now, most people's interaction with AI that they're cognizant of is like the 1990s ChatGPT, role-based computer game type thing. And so I think a lot of people are like, well, I don't really see how that's necessarily going to be, maybe writing a paper, maybe writing a sermon type of a thing. But, it's Apple just signed a thing with them. So like basically Siri is going to be a full-blown AI assistant that is multimodal and can do a bunch of stuff for you. I think it's going to get in the very near term where it's not just going to be, people writing a sermon or me writing a social media post or whatever. It's going to be like you said with the kitchen. Well, I don't order my own groceries anymore. I just let AI decide what I should eat for the week.
Yeah. Yeah.
And maybe for somebody that's great. For somebody else, that might be catastrophic.
Right. Well, and it's, and I know, like if you're very much like, how am I personally useful? And you see all these things encroaching on the things that make you feel useful. And whether it's because you feel like you have to get on board or because you're in an environment that forces it on you, that can lead to very discouraging, sensations, and having to figure out like, okay, how do I function as a productive member of society when I'm like pushing buttons and just approving of something a machine did, rather than, whatever. And that's where, and at what point, because, people are talking about using AI to automate, like, menial tasks, busy work, low value work. But it's like, if that's the work you do and you feel good doing it, and now someone's telling you this isn't valuable enough for a human to be doing, we're going to have, this other thing do it. That's where I think that's a lot of where what we talked about before about, upskilling and being aware of what's coming and, broadening your horizons and, figuring out what works and what doesn't, for you. I think that's where that becomes that much more important. And then in the context of the church, like doing things like, organizing small groups. If you have a database of people and their addresses and you want to be able to, plug people into, small group communities that are relatively local to them, or if you want to periodically mix up your small groups so people get into new communities, depending on what your strategy around that is. You could have a person who's just very good administratively, who's very good at saying, hey, let's have this person go here. And they just know stuff off the top of their head and whatever. But if you have a tool that can at scale go in and just do that for you, like, hey, we have a new member, a new attender, they want to get plugged in, put in their name, their address, boop. And it's like, oh yeah, they'll probably be a good fit over here. Like, huh.
Well, it goes back what's on that topic, because I am curious, like with your church, how much data you actually have like on your congregation and the people involved. Like
we have, I'm surprised.
Do you have a fair amount of stuff?
Yeah. I'm surprised by how much we do have.
Okay.
So we use a tool called Realm Connect, which is nobody's favorite tool. I know there's others like them that are, perhaps, dare I say, better. But I mean, it's a huge database of,
Okay. So there is data. There is data on.
Yeah. So there's like head of household, address, phone numbers,
number of people,
all that connection. Like it knows that my children are my children and my wife is my wife and all of that. And email addresses. So it's how we do a lot of our emailing and our contact for folks. Is through that. So there's a fair amount. And then on the financial side, they do, because they have to give you your tools for reporting for tax purposes. Yep. They know who's giving what. The way they present that are as giving units, which is, the first time you hear that, you're like, wow, that is shockingly impersonal. But it's like, well,
the GUs.
Yeah. But then it's like, well, but at the same time, I'm glad.
Yeah, no, I get it. I mean,
giving unit and not
it's
like
math.
Giving unit 775.
Right.
Versus the pastors knowing, hey, Joe is giving this amount to this thing. So there's a fair amount of data we have around that. And I think there's other things they can build in to even talk more about demographics. So if you have more of a demographic or interest driven, small group kind of concept and things like that.
Which, so that, and my reason for asking if, like at your church, you have some of that, I can absolutely see a world, because my guess is, maybe I'm wrong, but if it's like any organizations usually have tons of data, but they just don't have the time or resources to actually do anything actionable with it. Cause it's just like, who's actually going to figure out, who's going to take the time to go through this and actually come up with insights. Like, to me, I can see a world where AI would be extremely helpful to a church to say, who do we have? What opportunities might, who is connected to a small group? Who is not connected to a small group? How long have they been here? Who are the people, so that, again, maybe that person who is that kind of social connective tissue person may get additional insights and benefit from something like that, that's looking into this and going, hey, have you considered these types of a thing? But I can also see where that person could see that as a threat and go, well, that's kind of my job. And you're basically saying I'm not doing it good enough. Mm-hmm. It's like, well, no, it's just there's more information than you could physically process in the course of a year.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and even, so I think that, there's a lot of, because we do a fair amount with the data that we have, at least as regards, giving trends and trying to anticipate that for budgets and being responsible for that. But there's a lot of stuff that, if we had something that helped kind of organize people and say whether they're in a small group or not and things like that, not to just pick someone up and just plug them in wherever we feel like, but there'd be new better opportunities to engage and say, hey, would you like to be involved in one? There's one like 2 blocks away.
Right.
Room, for example. I don't know.
And I just know from system architecture on the corporate side, there are ways that you can use agents to take action and automate some of that stuff to, again, not necessarily take over.
Right.
But who's necessarily, or how many people fall through the cracks where somebody's new to the church, somebody doesn't recognize they're new, and, proactively reach out and say, hey, are you aware of these programs? We want to, I could see where there could be some real value to some of that kind of robotic, connecting people in, making them aware of resources, things like that could be super helpful, given the fact, even big companies with loads of cash usually don't have the resources to have people committed to just doing nothing but that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So how would you feel if an AI agent reached out to you after you attended church and said, are you aware of these groups? You might not even know. It might just say, hey, I'm Jill.
Yeah. If it said, hey, I'm Jill, I'd be like, leave me alone, Jill. I don't know you. But no, if it reached out, it's like, even if it was like, hey, I'm Jill, I'm, automated assistant for, the church you attended. Like that sort of thing, I think is fine. You'd be like, hey, here's the things that you could be interested in. Here's who you reach out to for each of these, or just, hey, click this button and we'll get you in contact with, so-and-so, the appropriate ministry leader. I think that would be, to me, that would be welcome, because it takes a lot of the guesswork out on my end as someone who's new about what's available and, who to get a hold of. And on the other end of it, if I were a staff person, now I'm not just cold calling people to be like, hey, I haven't seen your name before. Do you like children's ministry? I don't know.
Starting my career in sales, I'm having a few sales jobs. Cold calling is the worst. I could see that being a fantastic thing for an AI agent, because it has no fear of rejection, and it doesn't get its feelings hurt if somebody's like, just leave me alone. I just attended this Sunday with a friend. I'm not, we're like, oh, okay, well, thanks. Whatever.
Now what would be weird is if I never introduced myself to anyone, and a security camera caught me, picked up my face, found me on Facebook, and then got an email to me. That would disturb me.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And I feel like that might be a little bit of technological overreach by the church and technological dependence if they're doing facial recognition scanning as everybody walks in, and then automating all of that. We noticed you weren't at church this week.
Yeah. especially since I have Google Nest equipment, and pretty much anyone who's white and has no hair is like, hey, we think we see Joe out here.
Yeah, right.
No, you don't. Or it mistakes
you could just have the church set up your alarm on Sundays automatically, just connected to your phone, sets your alarm so that,
we noticed
just want to make sure you didn't miss it.
We noticed you've been 5 minutes late consistently.
We went ahead and backed up your alarm clock.
Oh, that would be
awesome. I can definitely see a world where this could go awry and people could be very concerned. But talking through some of these things, I do think there's some real opportunity where churches could benefit from. Again, we started this talking just basic, like a pastor using ChatGPT to help brainstorm a sermon topic or things like that, which I think is baseline. But I think even just some of these advanced things, the church would benefit greatly from, especially since a lot of churches I know are extremely resource constrained.
Yeah.
Not like they just have a surplus of people to just do all this stuff on the fly.
Well, yeah. And if you have, and at the other end of it, we've been talking about people who are vocationally in this teaching role. There's a lot of support staff. We've kind of touched on them, but when you talk about, volunteers, like, okay, we need some volunteers who are gifted teachers to run classes on, topical studies or Bible studies or whatever, on Sunday mornings or during the week, not small group leaders or whatever. But, if AI could give someone, like me, okay, I have a full-time job, 2 kids, I live a half an hour away from church, 45 minutes away from work on a bad day. To be able to tap into that, if I understand how to use it well, to say, okay, I can sit down in the evening, get some ideas generated, get some good ideas for cross references, pull that together, and say, hey, based on these passages in this, what are some, key points, just things to get juices going when the juices are dry, even, you're empowering then your volunteer core,
to do more.
Without
what I'm thinking as you're giving that example, we're a church who may be a little uneasy about going that far out of the gate. I'm even thinking of the scalability of the limited full-time staff that you have, being able to create some of these additional resources to then give out to some of these volunteer groups, where before they go, I don't have time, in addition to everything I'm doing, to create all this other stuff to provide to these other groups to keep some things. I could even see as a starting point going, you know what, at least now we have the scalability to create some additional resources, maybe through the discernment of the church leadership team, so that it doesn't go off the rails. Because maybe we're a little concerned, but I think, again, going back to AI discipleship, I think there's a real opportunity within the church to say, how do we help people do this well, so they're not just chat GPTing their small group notes, but they're going, well, but okay, but here's how you can use it, and here's an appropriate way to help create some resources and thought questions to discuss as a team and things like that. Like, oh, okay.
Yeah. Well, because I don't know how many churches currently do this, but I know our church does like sermon discussion guides. And that's the sort of thing where, on the one hand, you can have, good partnership between lead pastor and the person who creates them, or the lead pastor does it themselves. But ultimately, a good discussion guide says, what are the key questions that can be answered from this sermon, based on scripture, pull those out, present it. Probably something a good AI engine could help.
Well, and on that note, again, I know we're just kind of talking through things, but I hope this is the kind of thing that helps people go, oh, wow, like, we hadn't thought about this. But I even think about like what I do with our podcast and with my other podcasts, where I use AI to create a summary of it and create timestamps for key transition points in the conversation, where I would not have time, or I'd actually be distracted from our conversation if I was sitting here trying to take notes on all of that during the discussion. But again, even for a sermon, to be able to break it down and go, here were the key parts, here's where they occurred, potentially even chunking that into groups, and to your point, then being able to say, and here's a discussion guide for you to go further based on these things, and some biblical references that you could then dig into to take it to the next level. That kind of stuff, I think a lot of church leaders would go, I don't have time to do that. But I know the prompts that I would use that would make that happen in 2 to 5 minutes, from a 60-second sermon, which would just further extend the reach and the value that you would get out of something like that.
No, absolutely. That's the sort of stuff where, you asked the question earlier, or you verbalized the, if you're saving time, what are you doing with that time?
Yes.
And, this is also then asking the question, what are the things you do that take the most time, that would be saved the most without decreasing quality? So maybe you say, okay, I'm really nervous about running my sermons through AI.
Sure.
Really anxious about that. And I I have a lot of personal value in how I process that and work through that. Okay, great. Keep doing your sermons that way. Don't shave that time. But discussion questions, further reading, organizing of the small groups one, I'll use that. Organizing small groups, locating new curriculums that maybe you didn't know existed. Like, hey, what's, doing some of that, who are some, at least popular, if not trusted, there's another layer of discernment, speakers and writers who talk about this and study this a lot, pulling in some of that stuff. I really getting into there, where that can save you a lot of time, and the time you save is of high value, because now you can take everything that you've done there and do something more valuable with it. Compared to like without that assist, you'd be spending all your time getting that set up, and then you don't have time to execute anymore.
Right. Well, one example, and then we can probably come into the home stretch, but Like I think about this, like, so for me with my podcast, even my, weekly updates on things, I actually don't find any value from AI assisting in the creation of it. Because again, my process is I know how I do it. I have a structure behind it. I value the research I put into it and all those things. So actually I've tried doing it before and I actually can't even do it because I'm like, that isn't what I would say. This isn't how I would like I end up just getting frustrated. Now that's just me personally. Others might find tremendous help in that. I don't. But again, where I find tremendous value is what I can now do with what I created that before I would have never had time to do because it was like, well, when would I go back and do anything with this? I don't have that kind of time. And I can now repurpose it in different ways. And I think what's interesting, one of the questions a lot of times when I talk with people about AI is not only think about how can it affect what I'm doing today, but what are you not doing that you wish you could be doing that AI might be able to help you achieve that right now you just can't get to. And I think a lot of times that's not where people's heads are. They're just like, well, I do this today. How would I do this with AI? Instead of going, what am I not doing? Could AI help me do that?
Right.
And the answer to that is usually, well, yeah, absolutely it can.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I don't know any other concluding thoughts on this? I mean, I think this was, again, it started with kind of this, how do we avoid tech dependency, which we talked through some really important things, but also how do we think bigger than just, because I do think it's bigger than, so is AI in the church writing sermons? Like, well, I mean, I guess, but I feel like that's just such a narrow way of thinking about how we can leverage this technology to expand what we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah. And I think that kind of leads into kind of my, at least as it's summarizing in my head, kind of a summarizing thought is, if, we think of technology as being something that is intrinsically like depersonalizing and creating stronger barriers between people, because that's more how we've seen it function, I think, in many ways, at least at social scale. Whereas what we're talking about here at the end is how can we use technology so that we can create deeper connection. If I'm not nose in a book, head in a spreadsheet, like all this, if I don't have to spend that time doing all of that, how can I get closer in connection with the people that I'm ministering to who are in my care? Can really be, I think, a good driving, thought-provoking question. And then saying, oh yeah, actually I'm involved with a lot of budget work at my church. Shoot, if I didn't have to do all that analysis by hand, man, that's like 3 hours where I could be calling people, visiting people, doing real discipleship work. Yeah, let's do that. And I, your example of like breaking down the sermon and, making thoughtful questions with resources and further reading and whatever, and giving it to folks, and then they can do what they want with it. They don't have to do the whole thing all the time, but to be able to say, okay, I did that now in, 15 minutes instead of an hour, or an hour instead of 4. And now I can spend all that extra time reaching out to people, coaching them, helping them understand how to use these resources so that we have an impact when they roll out. Those are all things where we're using technology to deepen connection rather than to create more distance between us.
That has been my experience 100% with this, is what we end up doing with it is really, it's dependent on us and how we choose to approach it. And I think that's where, again, the discipleship of how to do it well is a better path than to just go good or bad. Like, do we do it or do we avoid it? And it's like, well, let's not just be that pedantic about it. Because there's room for us to, again, deepen it and deepen our relationships and take, light even further with it. So this was fun. I wasn't sure where we were going to go with it completely, but we ended up hitting on a lot of things that I hope it just, again, helps people think more broadly about it. Because again, this conversation isn't really happening in my exposure in church circles. And where it is, it's kind of a either taboo or really like, yeah, I don't know how I feel about all this. But I think it's largely because of a very narrow understanding of what the possibilities really are.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I enjoy our conversations as
Yeah.
always. So thank
Good.
you for making the time, and hopefully everybody enjoyed. Get you thinking about this, and we'll be back. I think we're good. We're good next week, right? Are we doing this next
Pretty
week?
sure we are. Yeah.
There was one I saw you decline that I know you can't make, but I think that's later in June. So I think we're good next week. So
Oh yeah, it's later in June. Yeah.
okay. So we will be back next week. Hope you found this valuable, and we will see you on the other side.